On the eve of his hanging, when the jail had gone quiet and even the guards spoke in whispers as if sound itself might judge them, Elias Crow sat alone beneath a single flickering lantern, the rope already prepared outside like a patient shadow, and as the night wind slipped through the cracks of the old wooden walls and carried with it the dry scent of dust and distant sage, he finally allowed himself to speak, not to the judge who had sealed his fate, not to the townsfolk who spat his name like a curse, but to the darkness itself, which had been his only companion for most of his life, and in that low, steady voice worn smooth by years of silence and regret, he began to confess a truth no one had ever asked for, a truth buried deeper than the shallow graves left behind in his wake, for the stories told about him had always been loud and sharp, full of gun smoke and fear, painting him as a man born cruel, a man who chose blood as easily as breath, yet as Elias leaned back against the cold stone and closed his eyes, he remembered a softer beginning, one that had never made it into legend, a beginning shaped not by violence but by loss, by a boy standing at the edge of a failing homestead watching his mother's hands tremble as she folded laundry she could no longer afford to keep clean, a boy who learned early that the Wild West did not care for gentle souls, that it rewarded those who hardened themselves against mercy, and so when the world first took from him, quietly, without ceremony, he did not fight back, he only learned, and learning, he would later realize, was the most dangerous thing a man could do, because knowledge showed him how easily power could shift, how laws bent away from the poor, how promises spoken by men in fine coats dissolved the moment the ink dried, and when his father vanished on a cattle drive that never returned and no one bothered to search past the first week, Elias learned another lesson, one far heavier, that absence could wound deeper than any blade, and so he grew into the spaces left behind, into the hunger and the unanswered questions, until the day he left home with nothing but a borrowed horse and a name he would later try to outpace, telling himself it was only for work, only for survival, never for harm, and for a while that lie held, as lies often do when they are spoken gently enough, but the road was long and unforgiving, and each town taught him the same quiet rule, that fear traveled faster than fairness. And when a man realizes he is already feared, he may choose to wear that fear like armor, and Elias did, not because he enjoyed it, but because it kept him alive, because it kept others from looking too closely at the cracks in his resolve, the nights when he lay awake staring at unfamiliar ceilings, listening to the sound of his own breathing and wondering when exactly he had crossed the line everyone claimed he was born on, and it was during one such night, years later, that the secret took root, the one no bounty poster ever mentioned, the one that would never be spoken aloud in court, for it did not fit the shape of a monster, it belonged instead to the shape of a man who had once been given a choice and had chosen wrongly, not out of greed or cruelty, but out of fear disguised as loyalty, a fear that bloomed the night he joined a small band of riders who promised protection and purpose, men who spoke of brotherhood under wide skies, and for a time he believed them, believed that shared hardship could cleanse the past, until one quiet job went wrong, not with gunfire or shouting, but with a single decision made in the dark, when Elias was ordered to stand watch while something unforgivable unfolded beyond the trees, and though he never raised his hand, never drew his weapon, he also never spoke, never stepped forward, and that silence, heavier than action, followed him ever since, echoing in every footstep, every mile, every rumor that grew sharper with retelling, until the name Elias Crow no longer belonged to him but to the stories others told to feel safer about their own choices, and now, sitting in the narrow cell with dawn waiting just beyond the horizon, he understood that this was the moment silence could no longer serve him, because legends died easily but truths did not, and the truth was this, he had spent his life running not from the law, but from the part of himself that had once known better, the part that had stood still when it should have moved, that had survived while someone else did not, and as he spoke into the darkness, voice rough but steady, he admitted that the blood-soaked legend of the Wild West was built as much on what men failed to do as on what they did, that his reputation had been shaped by others because he had allowed it to be, because wearing the mask of an outlaw was easier than facing the weight of regret, and though no one would be there to hear his confession when the sun rose and the gallows creaked awake with morning, Elias found a strange calm in finally naming the truth, in letting the wind carry it through the cracks and into the wide, indifferent sky, knowing that even if history refused to listen, the land might remember, and as the lantern flickered low and the night thinned toward dawn, he rested his head against the wall, no longer a legend, no longer a name on paper, but simply a man who had waited too long to speak, hoping, quietly, foolishly, that somewhere beyond the rope and the watching crowd, the truth might still matter. By the time Eleanor Ashcroft arrived in Red Mesa, The desert town had already learned her name, and it passed from mouth to mouth like a warning carried on dry wind, whispered in saloons and behind curtained windows, spoken softly by men who had outlived too many others, for she came dressed in black that was not new enough to be fashion and not old enough to be costume, riding a tired horse with steady hands and eyes that held the kind of calm only earned through grief, and no one greeted her when she dismounted because everyone had heard the stories long before she crossed the town line, stories that said every outlaw who had loved her had met a violent end, that men who rode too close to her shadow never rode away again, and whether those tales were true or only shaped by fear mattered little in a place like Red Mesa, where superstition often carried more weight than fact, and Eleanor seemed to understand this without needing it explained, for she did not ask for company or kindness, only a small adobe house on the edge of town, where the desert pressed close and silence felt familiar, and there she settled as if she had always belonged to the lonely places, tending a modest garden that struggled against the heat, walking each morning beneath a sun that showed no mercy, her presence both visible and distant, like a mirage no one dared approach, yet beneath the quiet routines was a woman shaped by deep loss, a woman who had buried love more than once beneath harsh skies, though never with the ease the stories claimed. Because each man she had cared for had been different, flawed in his own way, drawn to danger not because of her but because danger had always known their names, and Eleanor had loved them not for their violence but for the brief tenderness they allowed themselves only with her, tenderness that the world refused to let last, and so when she came to Red Mesa she carried no intention of loving again, only the hope of living quietly enough that fate might finally overlook her, but fate, like the desert, had a habit of finding those who wished to hide, and it found her one afternoon when the sun hung low and unforgiving, when a shadow collapsed near her door and did not rise again, and Eleanor, stepping outside with a basin of water, saw the wounded gunslinger sprawled in the dust, blood dark against his shirt, his breath shallow and uneven, a man no older than sorrow but worn by it all the same, and for a moment she stood still, because she recognized that moment well, the moment when a choice split the future in two, when walking away might preserve the quiet she had built, yet turning toward him would invite whispers, danger, and perhaps another grave, but Eleanor had never been able to turn away from suffering, and so she knelt beside him, dragged him inside with strength born of necessity, and set to work with calm hands and steady resolve, cleaning the wound, stitching torn flesh by lantern light while the town pretended not to watch, and as the gunslinger drifted in and out of consciousness he spoke a name she did not recognize, spoke of roads that never ended, and debts that followed like ghosts, and when he finally slept, Eleanor sat nearby listening to the night, aware that the dangerous new thread had already been woven, because by morning Red Mesa would know a man had crossed her threshold and survived the night, and survival, in this case, would be the most dangerous thing of all, and indeed the town noticed, for word travels fast where there is little else to carry it, and men who had sworn never to meet her gaze now watched from a distance as the gunslinger recovered slowly under her care. Learning his name was Samuel Reed, a man chased by his past more than the law, someone who had tried, unsuccessfully, to step away from the life that had shaped him, and as days passed and his strength returned, so did the quiet moments between them, moments filled with careful conversation and long pauses, with Eleanor moving about her home and Samuel watching as if afraid to speak too loudly and break something fragile, and though neither spoke of love, it lingered in the space between shared meals and gentle smiles, in the way Samuel's voice softened when he thanked her, in the way Eleanor listened as if his words mattered more than the rumors attached to him, and for the first time in years, she felt something warm and frightening stir within her chest, a hope she had sworn never to trust again, while Samuel, aware of the town's stories, wrestled with guilt and desire in equal measure, knowing that staying might endanger her yet leaving would wound them both in ways neither could pretend away, and the desert seemed to watch their quiet bond grow beneath the burning sun, indifferent yet witness to the way fate circled closer, because danger had never needed an invitation, and it arrived one evening in the form of riders at the edge of town, men Samuel recognized instantly, men who had not forgiven him for walking away, whose business thrived on bloodshed and loyalty enforced through fear, and when Samuel saw them, he understood with terrible clarity that Eleanor's name would soon be spoken again with dread, that loving him might seal the same tragic ending the town expected, and so he resolved to leave before nightfall, believing distance could still protect her, but Eleanor, wiser than he knew, saw the truth in his eyes before he spoke, and when he tried to say goodbye with words shaped by sacrifice, she stopped him, telling him softly that running had never saved the men she loved, that fear was not a shield, only a delay, and in that moment, beneath a sky streaked with red, they shared a quiet understanding that whatever came next would come honestly, without lies or sudden disappearances, and though they did not promise forever, they promised truth, and that promise carried a weight heavier than any vow. And so Samuel stayed one more night, the town holding its breath, the desert cooling as stars emerged, and Eleanor felt both joy and sorrow settle into her bones, knowing that love, once invited, never left without consequence. And as she stood beside him in the doorway, listening to distant hoofbeats and the whisper of wind across Red Mesa, she understood that fate was already weaving its design, a tragic and tender pattern shaped by choice and chance, by a widow who could not stop caring and a gunslinger who had finally found something worth standing still for, even if the price would be written in pain. And as the sun set behind the hills, painting the land in gold and shadow, the town waited, the legend sharpened, and Eleanor Ashcroft, the widow of Red Mesa, felt her heart open once more beneath the burning western sky, knowing that love, however brief, was still worth the risk. Deadwood Crossing had learned to live without law the way a body learns to live with a limp, slowly and painfully, adjusting to imbalance until it felt almost normal. And so when a lone rider appeared at the edge of town just as the afternoon light turned the dust to copper, no one rushed to greet him or reached for hope, because hope had a habit of getting men killed here. Yet there was something about the way the rider sat his horse that stirred unease, a straight-backed posture worn thin by exhaustion, a stillness that suggested restraint rather than weakness. And when he rode closer, the townsfolk saw the badge pinned to his coat, dull with age and scratched by years that had not been kind, and a murmur moved through Deadwood Crossing like wind through dry grass, for no marshal had held authority in this place for nearly a decade, not since the last one failed so completely that the town itself seemed to recoil from the memory. And the man riding in now knew that better than anyone, because his name was Thomas Hale, and he had once worn that same badge with pride before it became a reminder of everything he had lost. And as he dismounted slowly, favoring one leg, he felt the weight of eyes on him, eyes full of doubt and old anger, because even if time had blurred faces, it had not softened blame. And Thomas understood that his arrival reopened wounds the town preferred to keep buried, yet he had not come seeking forgiveness or belonging, only refuge and perhaps a final reckoning. For the road had given him little else, and the horse beneath him was as tired as he was, carrying a man who had been running from a past he could no longer outride. And Deadwood Crossing, broken as it was, had been the one place he swore never to return, which made it the only place left to go. And as he tied his reins and stepped onto the street, memories rose unbidden. Of laughter once heard outside the saloon, of children running free before fear taught them caution, of a younger man who believed a badge could be enough. And that belief had died the night Deadwood Crossing burned, the night he failed to stop the violence that tore the town apart and took with it the people he loved most, a failure that echoed still in the limp of his leg, the scar along his ribs, and the emptiness he carried like a second shadow. And now, standing there again, Thomas felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the instinct to leave before history repeated itself. But fate, relentless and unkind, had other plans, because even as he reached for his saddle to leave the badge behind, a gunshot cracked the air from somewhere near the edge of town, sharp and sudden, followed by screams that cut through the afternoon like knives, and in that instant, choice vanished, replaced by instinct. And Thomas turned toward the sound before his mind could argue otherwise, moving with a speed that surprised even him, his body remembering what his heart had tried to forget. And as he ran, townsfolk scattered, faces pale with recognition, because they knew that sound, knew what it meant, knew that the men who ruled Deadwood Crossing by fear were making another example, and those men were led by Caleb Rourke, a name Thomas had hoped never to hear again, a man who had once worn a deputy's star before trading law for power, before betrayal turned a fragile order into chaos. And it was Rourke's ambition, unchecked and brutal, that Thomas had failed to stop years ago, costing him his partner, his family, and the town's trust in one terrible night. And now Rourke was back in the open, reminding Deadwood Crossing who truly held control. And as Thomas reached the small square where the crowd had gathered, he saw a shopkeeper bleeding in the dirt, saw Rourke's men laughing with the ease of those who had never been challenged, and for a moment the past and present overlapped so completely that Thomas felt frozen, the old fear clawing up his spine, whispering that he had already failed once and would fail again, that stepping forward would only add more names to the list of the dead. But then he saw the fear in the eyes of the townsfolk, the quiet acceptance that this was simply how things were, and something inside him hardened, not into anger, but resolve, because he realized that leaving had not spared him pain, that running had only stretched it across years, and if the badge still rested on his chest, Then perhaps it was because the work was unfinished. And so Thomas stepped forward, voice steady despite the tremor in his hands, calling out Rourke's name in a way that carried across the square, a name spoken not with hatred but with authority long denied, and laughter died quickly, replaced by surprise, then recognition, and Rourke turned, eyes narrowing as he took in the sight of the man he had broken but not destroyed, a slow smile spreading across his face as if welcoming an old friend, and the exchange that followed was quiet but heavy with meaning, words about unfinished business, about how Deadwood Crossing belonged to those strong enough to take it, and Thomas listened, feeling the familiar weight of guilt pressed down on him, yet also feeling something new, a clarity born of nothing left to lose, and when Rourke mocked the badge, called it a relic of a failed past, Thomas answered simply that the past was not finished speaking, and the townsfolk watched in stunned silence as two men faced each other across a dirt-stained square, one representing the order that once was, the other the chaos that followed, and though no shots were fired that day, the line was drawn clearly enough that everyone understood what would come next, because Rourke did not fear Thomas, but he respected the disruption, the possibility that the broken marshal might stir something dangerous, something like courage, and so he retreated with a warning disguised as amusement, promising that Deadwood Crossing would soon remind Thomas why he had left, and as the dust settled and the injured were tended to, the town turned its attention to Thomas Hale, unsure whether to thank him or curse him, because his presence meant change, and change, here, often arrived on the back of violence, and that night, as Thomas sat alone in a room above the old sheriff's office, the badge placed carefully on the table before him, he confronted the ghosts he had tried to outrun, memories of a partner's laughter cut short, of a promise to protect that ended in fire and blood, of a moment of hesitation that had cost him everything, and he wondered if redemption was possible or if courage, once lost, could be reclaimed, and as the town prepared quietly for the war Rourke's return would surely bring, Thomas made his decision, not because he believed he could save Deadwood Crossing, but because he could no longer live with abandoning it again, and so at dawn he pinned the badge back onto his coat, feeling its weight settle where it belonged, and stepped into the street to begin the work no one wanted but everyone needed, knowing that heroism was not found in victory but in standing firm despite the certainty of pain, and as the sun rose over Deadwood Crossing, casting long shadows across a town on the brink, the last marshal stood ready to face his past, not as the man he had been, but as the one he had finally chosen to become. Long before any man thought to draw lines on maps or give names to the empty places, Black Canyon had existed as a wound in the earth, deep and twisting, where sunlight struggled to reach the bottom and even the wind seemed to lose its voice, and it was there, people said, that the devil himself had pressed his hand into the stone, leaving behind a vein of gold so pure it glowed like fire when first struck, yet every tale agreed on one thing, that no soul who took that gold ever truly kept it, and Jeremiah Boone had heard those stories since childhood, whispered around campfires and dismissed with uneasy laughter, but hunger has a way of dulling fear, and by the time Jeremiah found the map tucked inside the false bottom of a dead man's stillbag, fear had already lost its sharpest edge, for he was a prospector worn thin by failure, a man whose hands shook not from age but from years of hoping and being disappointed, and the map, drawn in faded ink on cracked paper, seemed to breathe possibility, marked with careful symbols and a single phrase written along the margin in a trembling hand, Black Canyon, last chance, and Jeremiah told himself that men often blamed curses when fortune turned against them, that superstition grew easily where truth was scarce, and so he packed what little he owned and set out across the desert, the sun bearing down with quiet cruelty as it always did, yet from the first night he felt something was wrong, because as he lay beneath the stars, the silence did not feel empty but crowded, filled with a low murmur just beyond understanding, like voices carried through water, and when he sat up, heart pounding, the sound faded, leaving only the wind and his own breath, and he told himself it was nerves, the mind inventing things when stretched too thin, but the whispers returned the next night, closer this time, shaping themselves around his name, speaking it softly as if spoken by someone who knew him well, promising that his wandering would end soon, that his hands would finally hold something worth the years he had lost, and each promise felt warm and reasonable, spoken in tones that sounded almost kind, and Jeremiah, despite himself, began to listen, because the desert offered nothing else but time to think and regret, and the voices knew his regrets, spoke of the farm he had lost to drought, of the woman who had waited as long as she could before turning away, of the nights he lay awake wondering if his life had already ended without him noticing, and when he reached the rim of Black Canyon at last, the whispers grew so clear they no longer felt external but woven into his thoughts, guiding his steps along narrow paths and down steep walls as if the canyon itself had opened for him, and the place felt wrong in a way that had nothing to do with danger and everything to do with memory, because the stone walls bore marks that looked almost like scars, smooth in places where no water ran, and Jeremiah felt as though he were walking through something that remembered every man who had come before him, and at the bottom, where the light dimmed and the air cooled, he found the gold exactly where the map promised, a vein shining faintly within the rock as if lit from within, and the sight stole his breath, for it was more beautiful than he had imagined, beautiful enough to quiet even the whispers for a moment, and as he touched it, the warmth spread through his palm and up his arm, filling him with a sense of certainty he had not known in years, and the voices returned, no longer whispering but speaking plainly, telling him that the gold was his reward for perseverance, that it asked only one thing in return. Not blood or pain, but devotion, that he must choose it above all else, carry it out piece by piece, and never turn away once he began, and Jeremiah laughed at that, a thin, nervous sound, because what was devotion if not the thing he had already given his life to, chasing one claim after another, and so he began to dig, working until his muscles burned and his thoughts narrowed to the rhythm of effort, and with each piece of gold he freed, the canyon seemed to sigh, the voices growing warmer, more approving, praising his determination, calling him worthy, and yet as days passed and he returned again and again to that hidden place, something inside him began to shrink, for he stopped sleeping deeply, stopped noticing the sky or the passing of time, caring only for the weight of the gold and the reassurance of the voices that followed him even beyond the canyon now, walking beside him across the desert, correcting his doubts, reminding him that turning back would mean returning to nothing, and when he tried, once, to ignore them, to rest for a day and think clearly, the silence that followed felt unbearable, like being abandoned mid-sentence, and panic drove him back to Black Canyon before the sun set, where the whispers welcomed him like an old friend, and it was then that Jeremiah began to notice signs he had overlooked, old tools scattered and half-buried, bones bleached white by time, scraps of cloth caught in the rocks, and he understood that others had found this place before him, had stood where he stood and listened to the same promises, and the realization should have frightened him, should have driven him away. Yet the voices soothed his fear instantly, telling him those men had failed only because they doubted, because they wanted to leave with less than everything, and Jeremiah, desperate not to be counted among failures, pressed on, digging deeper, carrying more, until his body ached and his thoughts no longer strayed beyond the canyon's walls, and one evening, as a storm gathered overhead and thunder rolled through the stone like distant laughter, the voices asked for more than effort, asked him to stay, to make the canyon his home, to give himself fully so the gold would never abandon him, and in that moment, clarity cut through the fog like lightning, because Jeremiah saw himself as he was becoming, a man hollowed out, kept moving by promises that never ended, rich in metal and poor in everything else, and with a strength born of sudden fear, he stepped back from the vein, covering his ears, shouting into the darkness that he would not stay, that no gold was worth losing himself entirely, and the canyon answered with a sound that was not quite anger and not quite sorrow, the whispers rising into a roar that shook the stone and sent dust raining down, accusing him of weakness, of ingratitude, of trying to escape the price everyone paid, and Jeremiah ran, stumbling through narrow passages as the voices followed, louder and sharper now, reminding him of every loss, every regret, every empty year waiting beyond the canyon, and when he reached the open desert at last, he did not stop running until dawn broke and the whispers faded into memory, and though he escaped with his life, he carried nothing else with him, no gold, no map, only the knowledge of how close he had come to vanishing into a legend, and years later, when other prospectors spoke of Black Canyon and its devil's gold, Jeremiah would listen quietly and say little, because he knew the truth was not that the gold was cursed, but that it spoke to the parts of men that were already breaking, offering riches in exchange for the one thing they could never afford to lose, and somewhere deep in Black Canyon, the vein still waited, glowing softly in the dark, patient as the desert itself, ready to whisper again when the next desperate soul came searching for one last chance.